Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, will now begin the first REAIM Talks of the REAIM Summit 2024. Today's REAIM Talks will focus on the topic of essential AI insights for policymakers. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Zena Assad, Senior Lecturer of the Australian National University, as our moderator. As you can see on the stage, we are joined by 3 esteemed speakers as well. Before I hand over the microphone to our moderator, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome them with a big round of applause. And our moderator, please proceed to the session.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and welcome. I know it's been a very long day for everyone, and we're actually really excited to be your closing session for today. So hopefully we will keep you at least mildly entertained for the last hour of the day. So a lot of the discussions and the panels that we've had today have been quite exploratory, talking about responsible AI in the military domain. And in this panel, we're going to dig down a little bit deeper and talk about some of the more specific applications of responsible AI. And we're specifically going to look at perspectives on the critical aspects of AI that policymakers should consider when shaping national and international approaches to responsible AI. So I'm joined today by a very wonderful panel. We have Dr. Jung-Woo Ha, who is the head of Future AI Center at NAVA. We have Amy Hogan-Burney, who is the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for Cybersecurity Policy and Protection at Microsoft. And we have Dr. James Landay, who is the Co-Director of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI at Stanford University. Now, each of our panelists comes from a very different background and very different perspective. So I'm going to actually start by giving each of them just a quick minute to explain what their expertise is so that we have a little bit of context of where their perspectives are coming from. So Jung-Woo, I'll start with you.
Okay. Nice to meet you and welcome to Korea. I'm Jung-Woo Ha from Naver and Naver Cloud. I am the AI research head for Naver. So I am responsible for long-term AI research and AI governance and the global AI ecosystem strategy. Basically, I am a machine learning research scientist, but nowadays I am focusing on managing or directing the research teams and AI, the safety teams. So, okay.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Amy Hogan-Burney from Microsoft. I am responsible for the cybersecurity policy and protection team, and that name tells you nothing, right? If you listen to it, you don't know what that means. So I will take a minute to explain. I manage the cybersecurity legal compliance team, so Microsoft's compliance with all global regulations around the world. Our cybersecurity policy team, so all policy work associated with cybersecurity around the world. Our digital diplomacy team, which does all of the work associated with diplomacy, standards, norms, and is essential in the work that we're doing here at the conference today. And then our digital crimes unit, which is the unit that does all of our proactive legal actions against nation-state actors and cyber criminals to disrupt criminal infrastructure and to protect the digital ecosystem.
Perfect. And James?
So by training, I'm a computer scientist, though I've worked for the past almost 30 years in an area called human-computer interaction and design, thinking about how do we design applications and systems for people. Through that whole career, I've worked on AI often as the underlying ingredient in thinking about the future of technology and how people interact with it. I've mainly done most of my career in universities, but I've also worked in industry at Intel, Microsoft, Google, as well as a couple of startups. And about 5 years ago, we founded a new institute at Stanford for human-centered AI, and I was one of the co-founders, and I'm now the co-director of that.
That's wonderful. I want to touch on some of the work that you do in this center, James, a little bit more. So over the last few years, really, we've seen some of the far-reaching impacts, which have been both positive and negative, of AI across various different areas of our society. Can you share what some of the challenges are of designing AI systems such that they have a more positive social impact?
Yeah, so when we founded the Institute, we named it Human-Centered AI because we thought that was very important, and especially I, as the one coming from a human-centered field, really stuck on that human-centered piece. But after a couple of years, I realized that that term really meant different things to different people, and so that we had to really put a little more meat on the bones of what that meant. And in what I believe human-centered means for AI is that we need to think about how AI has impacts beyond the direct user of AI systems. So when I'm building a traditional application for somebody's phone or for your desktop, the main user is the main person who's impacted by it. But AI systems impact people much more often beyond the direct user. So we can think about communities, for example, communities who are labeling training data, or communities whose decisions are being made about them, whether in policing or health. And then finally, if an AI system is really successful and is ubiquitous across society, we have impacts at the societal level. So to design this in a human-centered way, we actually have to go beyond the field that I've worked in for 30 years of user-centered design, and we need to think about how we do community-centered design and society-centered design and really embed each of those and connect them together in a way to make sure we're going to have a more positive impact with AI.
Mm-hmm. And so, Amy, building on from that, from your perspective, having worked at Microsoft, which from the outset looks like a very user-centered kind of organization in the way that it develops its products, would you say that broader societal implications are something that you do try to capture in the work that you do?
So yes, and I think there are kind of countless examples of how we started very early thinking that way. So we actually last week had the 5-year anniversary of our Office of Responsible AI. And so 5 years ago, we knew that we really needed to be very user-centric. And so we know from a customer perspective that this is going to have a large-scale impact, and we want to make sure we take that seriously from the very beginning, so that at the very design process that we're being very thoughtful in that space. And then the other part is in May of 2024, we actually released our first ever Responsible AI Transparency Report. And this report goes very detailed into how we are designing our products, how we are using our data, what types of guardrails are in place, and what you can expect from us in the future. So I think that very user-centric approach is very important. And then I'll just add one last part, which is we've made a very conscious decision in all of our products that they're all called a co-pilot. And I don't know if anyone's noticed that, but we have a co-pilot for security, we have a co-pilot for Office 365, because we are very aware that this is something we believe AI will assist humans, but it is not going to take over the thoughtful process that we all need to be engaged in.
That's really interesting. I have one additional question for you, Amy. Because of the publicity that AI receives, there is often some misinterpretations about what these systems can and can't do. How much of education for the general public comes into the work that you do when you think about designing these systems for positive social impact?
Yeah, I think education is going to be one of the most important things, and I think education is required on several different levels. So first, I think we'll start high and go low. Starting at the highest levels, our policymakers and those regulating in this area need to understand the technology that they are using, because you certainly cannot regulate without understanding it. So I'm hopeful that conferences like this one will be a very important way for us to drive education in this area so we can drive smart regulation in this space. But more important than that, I think, are cyber skilling initiatives. So we are going to have a huge user base of individual consumers that are going to be using AI. And so having skilling in that area will be incredibly important. We recently have committed to skilling initiatives around the world. I actually had to check this statistic before I came on stage because I thought it sounded quite lofty. But we've committed to 2.5 million skilling over the course of 1 year in Southeast Asia alone. So we're going to upskill 2.5 million people in the next year in order to be able to adequately use AI and to help with that education.
So then, Jung-Woo, from your perspective, how much does education for the general public come into the work that you do?
This situation is similar in Korea. So when the days when release the ChatGPT release, that there are many people has a big interested in the using ChatGPT, but there are some very critical using case for the large language models. For example, some employees input their very some the confidential points into the ChatGPT for the making some the more refine their result, but that is the confidential issues. So that is related to some the literacy issues. So people should know what can we do or what cannot do using generative AI. But these kind of literacy or how to use generative AI should be learned using some education programs. So we have some the profitable foundation, the Naver, the Connect Foundation. So we provide some how to use generative AI program for the diverse universities or the people or citizens using our channels. Also, we are providing the video content to many people. Also, we we organizing some event how to safely use or effectively use generative AI. Also, we are collaborating with many universities and the other companies for the better and safer using generative AI applications for the citizens or the other peoples. Yeah.
So sorry, go ahead, James.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this education of using AI really happens at many levels. So, one is just consumers. Some folks are scared of, interacting with AI. And, I try to encourage people, try some tasks that you're an expert in and try to actually ask a ChatGPT or your favorite Gemini or other agent to do something for you and see where it does well and doesn't do well. Or try like planning a vacation. And you'll iteratively go through it, and you'll see the things that it can't do and the things where it messes up. And so that's important for people to just feel comfortable understanding what it does. But even in companies, some companies, don't want their employees to use these things, especially if they don't have a careful sandbox where they can put confidential information in. But those employees are going to be the people who are going to come up with interesting new use cases. And so it's actually important that people experiment. And then finally, in schools, this is just the thing that's going to happen. I like to say I'm glad I don't have young children at the moment, because the next 5 years are going to be this real big fight about how AI is used. But by the end of it, we're going to figure out how to change how we teach young kids and change how we evaluate. And that's going to really lead to a renaissance in education, because it's actually going to also allow a lot of innovation that's been locked out of our school system. So all of those levels are very important, as well as, educating government staff. So at HAI, we actually have U.S. congressional staffers for the 3rd summer in a row come to Stanford and learn about AI, because these are the folks who are writing the legislation. We've also done work with the ASEAN countries, with the foreign ministers and others. So education has to happen on all these different levels.
If I could, just very quickly, first I want to agree very much with everything that James said. And I encourage anyone in this room who hasn't used AI in their personal life in some way to please do it. And also, many times there's a citation associated with the fact that you've gotten, to actually look at the site itself and compare it to the result that you've received, and then actually provide feedback, because we do take and value that work. And this is why there's a collective play here for AI and an improvement that can happen in this space. And I agree with you too about education. In the next 5 years, the education system is going to dramatically change. And there is no way you're going to keep AI systems out of schools. It's going to be about how to appropriately use them and what that looks like in the future.
So when we think about AI from a policy perspective, and I can hear the significance of education resonating among the three of you, how much of education requirements do you think should be embedded in the policy that is being developed around AI for different contexts? So I might start with you, James.
So do you mean with respect to the policymakers, or with respect
Absolutely. So for policymakers who are generating policy for AI.
I don't think policymakers need to be experts in AI to be able to think about regulating it, just like we don't expect them to be experts in medicine or in transportation to do it. But they do have to have some understanding about how it works, what it can do, what it can't do, and maybe what, the short-term future, at least, of its development. Anything longer than that, everyone's making up facts. So I do think that's really important. And so again, I think this is why it's incumbent upon universities and other places that have the capabilities to train policymakers, people working in nonprofits, and for us as well, we have our corporate affiliates program where a lot of our corporate affiliates simply want that kind of training for their high-level managers and executives so they understand where things are going. So all of those kind of training things are important for people to make policies that are going to make sense.
And then Amy, from your perspective, mostly when companies produce things, there's always educational material or informative material that accompanies something that's produced. So how much do you think that should be embedded with AI systems that Microsoft produces? Should there be a requirement that there has to be some kind of educational piece of information that accompanies these systems when they're produced?
Yeah, I think not only should there be a requirement that you understand the tool that you're using, I think there should be a requirement that you're explaining how the tool itself was created. And so I think the reason that we released the first Responsible AI report in May was exactly for that, which was to explain how the tools you're using are created. And we'll continue to do that in the future because I think that's incredibly important for each user.
Absolutely. And then Jung-Woo, I just wanted to expand a little bit more. So you were talking about some of the educational activities that you're a part of for some of the systems that you develop. How general are these educational activities? Like, are they aimed at a general audience? Are they aimed at people of all different ages? Do you create different things for different people? Because this is really one of the complexities of these AI systems, is making it accessible across the board is actually more challenging than we think it is.
Actually, the generative AI or the frontier AI or the new AI are the very powerful tool for their everyday lives or their how to work. So that means how to effectively use the capability of the using AI is a new capability for each human. So that means the people can be enhanced using the AI or not. So actually, the government or the other companies should support the how to use AI with their education programs. So I think we need to make some more detailed program, considering the level of the familiar or each capability, I think. So for the totally new novice or the other expert. And the other issue, as for policymakers, I think to more the effective make some the policy for AI. So policymakers should use AI for totally perfectly understand the AI limitation and the AI the advantage of AI. So I recommend all policymakers should use AI and understand AI and make them their policies. So they can make the really effective the policies, I think. Yeah.
I agree with that recommendation entirely.
Yeah.
But then I have a question that I'm actually going to direct back to you, Amy, working from the development side. There's a fine line between how much information you can know about a system in order to use it and how much information you know about a system to a point that you then understand its vulnerabilities. So how do you strike that balance between providing enough information such that these systems are safe and positive to use versus protecting the system to an extent to reduce those vulnerabilities?
Yes, so I think there are clear things that you should be doing from a security perspective, and many of them are not different from other products and services, right? So you know that you need to protect the data that is training the model, you know that you need to protect your model, and then you know that you need to protect the output of those models, and that's very clear. I also think that it's very important that we consider how the user is going to use the AI itself. And so we've had a conversation about the positive uses of AI so far, and about skilling and about policy. But we know from past experience that with any technology, the positive use is not always what's going to happen. We have a lofty plan for good intended use, but I also know that there will be malicious use. So I think it's very important that we're clear in thinking about how actors will use it. So at Microsoft right now, we're actually tracking 300 different threat activity groups. Those are between nation-state actors and cyber criminals. And in the course of tracking those 300 actors, we're also seeing how they are using AI capabilities. So I think it's very important that we're sharing that. So in February of last year, we published a blog where we went through 3 or 4 different nation-state actors from Russia, from China, from North Korea. And we talked about how we were seeing these actors use large language models, how they were using this technology. And we were very clear that, first off, if we saw them using these AI technologies on our own systems, we would shut them down. The second thing we were very clear about is if we saw these threat actors using other technologies. So because we are tracking threat actors, oftentimes we see them using other systems. If that's the case, then we will notify the other company, whether it's OpenAI or Google or someone else, and they can take their own course of action. And then the last part that we were very clear about is that we would inform governments of these uses, we would be transparent about it, and we would continue to make these clear. So if you look at that February blog, there's a list at the very bottom of every way we think that we're going to be seeing malicious actors from nation states or cyber criminals use these tools, and we're going to continue to be transparent in how we report that use as well.
You know, I think with the use of AI being used in a way that we didn't expect it to be used, that's something that could be said of most technologies or of most systems, really. People using things in ways that they weren't intended to be used. So from a social impact perspective, James, what is the trade-off between having systems that are so widely and easily accessible by AI and then having them used arguably in greater malicious ways because of that accessibility? What is a way that we can try and combat that trade-off?
Yeah, so there's always this trade-off, and there's this debate, you know, in the community between really open AI systems, let's think of it as open source versus closed. And, you know, one of the arguments against open source is, you know, it's easier for malicious users to modify it and use it in new ways. But the real argument for open source is that's the only way for us to collectively understand how these systems work. And I think the field is really going to move that way. And when I say open source, I don't mean just open weights like we see with Meta's Llama. I mean open source, where we know exactly what the training data that went in there was. Maybe we don't release all that because a lot of that training data may be proprietary or paid for, but we should know what's in it, just like we do with our food. We want to know what the ingredients are. That's the only way we can know how it will affect our bodies. Similarly, we need to know the data that's in these systems, and then we also need to know kind of what code was used to create it. And so I think there's going to be a big move over time. Not everybody. Some of these large companies are going to still be proprietary, but if we're going to build all of our societal infrastructure, which we are, whether it's defense, education, health, government, on top of these systems, we actually need to understand how they work much better than we do today. We actually don't understand why these large language models work the way they do. So if we're going to build our applications of all of society on what we call foundation models, we're going to need much more of an effort of being open about them and understanding how they work, and that really probably requires non-corporate actors, or at least collaborations between government, academia, and corporate to, you know, build some models at scale that are open so we can have the science to understand how they work.
You know, it's interesting when you're talking about how we don't really understand a lot of these systems. And what's interesting to me is that the more complex these systems get, complexity really is a double-edged sword, right? So the more complex these systems get, the more kind of capabilities we get out of them, but the more challenging they are to manage and to regulate. So from your perspective, Jung-Woo, working in this area, how do you balance that complexity? Balancing wanting these systems to be more complex so that we can get better capabilities out of them, but also balancing some of the challenges that come with that complexity.
Yes, you mean the balance, complexity, and the others.
The challenges of complexity.
Okay. Yes. Actually, the innovation of the large language model or foundation models are from the scaling laws, and the scaling laws leads to the much more complexity, I think. So these scaling laws, the complexity by scaling laws makes them the really astonishing capability of many diverse general purpose capability in many diverse tasks, right? But I think this complexity makes the of controllability or transparency or accountability much worse compared to the previous AI technologies. Of course, nowadays there are the mechanical interpretability research works that coming out from the many diverse research organizations. But I think this complexity makes them the other issue to managing or the kind of there exists more rooms to be vulnerability by via the external, the adversarial attack or the security issue as well, I think. So when they make some more complex models, so each AI providers or researchers should make some more way how to enhance some more transparency or accountability in most of the models. So I think the mechanical interpretability research is on kind of the good approaches for to deal with that kind of issues, I think.
So I want to pick up on something Jung-Woo said and direct the question towards Amy. You mentioned complexity and vulnerability. And so my question to Amy is, would you argue that complex systems are more vulnerable in comparison to less complex systems?
Yes and no. Well, yes, I would say anytime you have complexity, what's required is to have more visibility. So you cannot have complexity and turn a blind eye to the idea that you have that complexity. So in any time you're securing a system, you have to deeply understand all aspects of it. So when we talk about AI, you need to know the data, the source of that data. You need to know how that data is secured and stored. Then you need to understand the model itself and how that model will be trained on that data. And then you need to understand the output of that. And so I think with any system that we've ever looked at, it's understanding the complexity itself and being very clear about what could become vulnerable in that space. The good news, I do think, is that by using AI, you do have an advantage. And so being able to look across in a systematic basis, in scanning for pattern-based information, looking at large sets of data, and taking repetitive actions, you can utilize the tool that you're creating to increase your security posture.
So then I want to just build on from that. James, how do you think from a practical perspective that we could capture some of those challenges of complexity and trying to protect these systems against vulnerability from a policy perspective?
Well, again, I think from a policy perspective, I think we're going to see calls for more transparency so that more researchers out there, not just at a particular company, can try to understand why AI models are behaving in the way they are. You know, is this model acting like a Nazi because it was trained on a horrible Reddit group? I don't know, because I don't know what it was trained on, right? These are questions that one can't get at just by poking the model. At some point, we're going to have better understanding of what went into the model. And we're at a stage where, obviously, companies, for proprietary reasons and sometimes for copyright reasons, don't want to disclose that. But that, I think, over time is going to change. I think there's going to be policy demand for that. I also think what Amy said in terms of using AI models to help with some of these problems is another thing. Like, for example, developers already are using AI models to kind of check the output of their AI model to make sure it's doing what their prompt is asking it to do. So we're already even seeing this use of even the same model or other models as a way of kind of reducing some of the risks by checking each other. And we see that in our own development of applications. It's a way to make it more reliable. Whether that gets us to the level of reliability that certain really critical applications in health or defense, which are going to require much better reliability than what I might expect for summarizing my document or for entertainment or planning my vacation to Switzerland. Like, different applications are going to require different levels of this. And so we're still in the early stages of figuring these things out. I think that's one thing for people to understand is, some companies will have people thinking, hey, if I don't AI-ify my whole, company by next year, the year after, we're toast. This is going to be a 10 to 20-year transformation of our economy. Yes, certain fields, especially tech, is going to move faster, but other things are going to move slowly, and we should be careful as we do this and understand what we're doing.
So, historically speaking, I think there's been a little bit of a tension between policy and regulation and industry. But in this situation, I feel that there's quite a lot of anticipatory work that's going into policy and regulation. So Amy, from your perspective, how much influence or impact do you feel that you have in your role on emerging policy and regulation for AI systems?
Yeah, I think we've been very clear that we welcome the conversation on regulation, and we've set forth a lot of ideas in this space as well. So at the end of June, beginning of July, we released a 52-page white paper about synthetic media and content and how we believe that this should be regulated. So included in the 52 pages was a conversation about provenance and about how deep fakes are out there and what watermarking should be done and what we should be doing to make clear where there is synthetic media used. Also in there is a lengthy discussion about the fraudulent use of synthetic media and where we see that going. And then there is a call for a legislative proposal inside the United States. But we actually are going to take that white paper and we're going to advance it in other jurisdictions. So the plan is that we started in the US, we're a US-based tech company, but this is something that we're going to do in other places. So you can look forward to seeing the same thing in Europe and throughout Asia as well, because we would like to make sure that as policymakers are thinking about this, that they have some framework to be able to do it.
I was just going to add that, Microsoft's been really one of the companies ahead of this. Brad Smith has really provided leadership. But you see different policy legislation happening in different places, whether it's the EU law or the recently passed law in California, which is not yet signed by the governor. And, some of these laws are focused on the wrong things. So, there's people out there who are worried about, AGI and, Terminator-like AI taking over the world. And this is purely a distraction.
It is.
It's a distraction from what I call the 3 Ds or maybe 4, which is what Amy mentioned. So deep fakes already happening, leading to people committing suicide with fake porn, fake political things, disinformation, which again we've seen in election years especially, and discrimination and bias. These are things that we could stop all AI development today, and the models that are out there now are doing these things. And then finally, the last D is displacement of jobs, which we haven't quite seen yet, though we might already be seeing it in, for example, commercial art. And there's some areas where that's something we need policymakers to be thinking about. How are we going to retrain people or make sure that people have a living? So those are the kind of things that policy needs to look at and not be looking at the Terminator, which is really a distraction to get you not to look at the real problems today.
I agree. I agree entirely. And I think one of the reasons why we have so many people who are focusing on this kind of dystopian future about AI is because of the public narratives around AI. Really, there are so many public narratives that are not always very accurate. And one of the things we've been talking about in this panel is the significance of education, and specifically education for the general public. And I think this is why a lot of us argue for the need for education. If we had better education of these systems for the general public, we'd have a better understanding of what they are and are not capable of, and would hopefully help to mitigate some of those dystopian kind of narratives and futures, which really are having quite a significant effect. I mean, as you said, James, we're seeing them in some of the laws that are coming up and some of the policies that are coming up. We're seeing these not so accurate pieces of information being reflected. A big one that I always talk about is hallucinations. I do not like the use of that term at all. I don't like how it originated. I don't believe that it's an accurate representation of what is happening with these systems. But it's become quite a mainstream term, right? Like we see hallucination in policy documents and we see it emerging. So it just goes to show the power of language and narratives. So I might then direct this question to you, Jung-Woo. How have you found when you're developing these systems and you're working with this area, how have you found what the challenges are in balancing people's perceptions of the technology versus what the technology is actually capable of?
I'm sorry, please.
Have you found it challenging to explain to people what these technologies are actually capable of, as opposed to the way that they think or what they think these technologies are capable of? Do you find that there's a difference there?
Yeah. Actually, that is the main challenging issues in the viewpoint of the AI providers. So many people worry about the very rare cases, kind of some Terminator or the other AGI, the kind of some Skynet, something like those. But in my viewpoint, it is really, really difficult to make that kind of the systems. So I think the AI provider has some duty to explain what the current AI, what can be done or what can be achieved by the current AI, and what function can be performed by current AI. So even AI providers are try best to kind of explain each function of using the generative AI. So I think that kind of instead of that kind of some issues, kind of some SF style issues, but actually the policymakers and AI providers should more practical challenges, kind of some, for example, making some malicious uses or the misinformation or disinformation. So some people do not know the contents are the misinformation by generative AI because considering some hallucination or bias issues, right? So these are limited. So many people should know these limitation for the older people, I think. So there's some difficulty or the challenging issues should be explained by the expert and the AI provider, I think, yeah.
And I know, Jung-Woo, that you do a lot of work around digital divides for technology in terms of accessibility. So how can we develop and promote more inclusive technologies to try and reduce digital divides?
Yeah, actually, everybody knows the AI can make some innovation and opportunity to enhance their the economy or the other social society challenges issues, something like those. But many global South countries do not have that kind of capability to make their own generative AI or large language models, considering these AI to develop a strong AI requires many the capital and the resource and some the experienced engineers. So these are some gap, the digital or AI gap between the developed countries and the global South countries. So I think the global organization, multi-nation organizations such as the UN or OECD, also the developed countries or global tech giants should consider this situation and provide some technologies or platforms for and to help the global south country to develop or secure the sovereign AI, something like those, I think. So I think this is some the items for global collaboration and global solidarity to make some more sustainability, I think. So this is in the line of the AI inclusivity and diversity. These for sure, this effort make the world or the global capability more sustainable, I think. Yeah.
So then I have a question leading on from this for Amy. Amy, there's quite a lot of criticism around technologies that are developed in Western countries and how they're not applicable more globally, or technologies that are developed in developed countries that are not applicable in developing countries. Can you shed a little bit of light on what the actual challenges are of trying to create a technology that would be globally accessible?
Yeah, I mean, I think first we can all recognize that getting to where we even are right now with respect to how AI can be used has required a tremendous amount of investment. So there is a tremendous amount of investment in the compute power and other things, and unfortunately, those things are largely done by private sector companies that have the ability to invest in that way. At the same time, we recognize that we need to make sure that this technology is broadly available. And because of that, we've made commitments around the world to make sure that that is the case. And so as you mentioned, in the Global South, we need to make sure that these technologies are available in the Global South. But I want to pick up on one thing that James said earlier, which I think is going to be incredibly important in this space. And that's going to be partnering with the governments themselves as well. So these aren't decisions that we should be making alone. We should offer the ability to have skilling, we should offer the ability to have access to technology, but we shouldn't make choices about how that technology is going to be used in all jurisdictions around the world. That's going to require partnerships with governments and with those in the local jurisdiction to know how they are going to be best put to use in the education system, best put to use in public safety or public health or other areas. So I think it's important that we are very, very thoughtful about not how we use the technology that we've helped to build, but in the right ways, in the right jurisdictions to generate the right growth in those global areas.
Go ahead.
So I think your question actually gets at two distinct but important problems. So one is, you'll often hear folks in the AI industry say things like, oh, AI is going to democratize education, or AI is going to democratize healthcare. It won't. It will only happen if we choose that's what we want to do and we invest it. It will be like every other technology. It will be taken up first by the people with the higher education and the higher amount of money. It's happened with every technology. It will happen again. So we can make up phrases like that, but unless we have action from governments and companies saying, no, we're really going to do this, it won't happen. That's one issue. The other issue of this question of AI for different parts of the world is really important because, again, it comes back to the training data. So the AI models that are out there now, and there's hundreds, but let's talk about the ones that are the ones that really perform well, which is a very small list. They're trained on data that mainly comes from North America and Western Europe because that's where a lot of the data is on the internet. And because of that, they actually embed cultural values or even ways of being, that are inherent to Western societies and Western cultures. And that's going to be a big problem, again, if this is a societal foundation technology that I'm going to build everything of my society on, whether I'm in South Korea, whether I'm in Kenya, whether I'm in Peru, I'm going to want it to reflect the values of my society when I build those applications. So this is a big issue, and it's a research question of, well, can we tweak these models to get them to behave differently, or do we need to build different models, whether it's sovereign AI? And so I think, again, for a technology that we expect to be the foundation for all of our societal systems, we're going to need more open collaborations between universities that are, where some of the top AI has come from, whether it's Stanford, MIT, Cambridge, whatever, as well as large companies in different parts of the world that want to make sure it works in their culture and countries so that we understand it. And then that information will also feed back to the big players, whether it's Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, that will affect what they do in the future. So we need to be focusing on all of these different paths for AI to make sure we understand it, so we make it culturally appropriate for different countries, and so that people don't feel like AI is yet another kind of colonialism in some ways.
Well, cultural and societal contexts aren't stagnant, really. They're amorphous. They change over time. So with the work that you do in the Institute for Human-Centered AI, how do you capture that kind of evolution of cultural and social context in a system?
Yeah, so one importance is to think about who is developing these AI systems. It can't just be technologists. So we actually, of course, need designers, but we also need sociologists and humanists and artists. Artists have always reflected on technology and how it's changing society. Again, for a society crossing technology, we actually need all of these different specialties, law, medicine as well. And so, again, this is why I think universities have a big place to play in this, because they have all of those specialties. And so that's why we need that sector involved in this development.
As somebody who works in an interdisciplinary space, I know the challenges of working with people from very different backgrounds. It can be very rewarding, but it can also be very challenging because we all have our own perspectives and we all think that our way of doing things is the correct way of doing things. Now, Amy, I know that you have interdisciplinary teams in Microsoft working in these areas. Can you elaborate a little bit on both the opportunities but also the challenges of working in an interdisciplinary team? And I want to focus a little bit on that, not to be negative, but to explain really how challenging this situation is to bring all these different voices and perspectives together for a positive outcome.
So yes, it is challenging. I am an engineer by training, but a lawyer now. And so that means that I was once a very binary thinker, and now I am not a very binary thinker, which is, was somewhat unusual. But that is kind of the challenge that we're consistently seeing as we are working on these systems. We make a very clear point. We have an Office of Responsible AI that is led by a policymaker, but we have a companion office that is an engineering office that is led by an engineer. And they actually both happen to be women. And so the two women work very, very closely together, because every time you make an engineering decision, there is a policy outcome that needs to be considered from a much broader perspective. And so I think that has been incredibly important. And also, I think that they would both tell you incredibly challenging. Engineers like to make decisions in a very binary way, where they are writing code for a very specific outcome that is the outcome that they believe will happen and has considered, whereas a policymaker understands that yes, this is the outcome they want, but there are also 7 other outcomes that may happen as a result of the engineering system that we've had. And I think you really addressed a lot of this when you were talking about what type of training data are we using, how are we seeing these results, and we have to be incredibly thoughtful in that space. And I think that's why that kind of policy with engineering decision is really important as we're working on these.
But even when they have these people, one thing that's important is where are they in the organization? Yeah. So we've seen a lot of these responsible AI efforts kind of mirror privacy and security. So often like, oh, there's a checkoff before you can ship a product. And we found that just doesn't work. The best example, unfortunately, is social media, where essentially, some of the best computational social scientists in the world regularly would say, hey, this version will be less harmful, but by that point, it's already ready to ship. Guess what? Money talks, and it goes. So it's really important that these diverse backgrounds are embedded on engineering and development teams, because then they have social capital, which leads to influencing what things are even thought about being built. Because if we just do trust and safety, like checks at the end, not saying we don't want to do those, but it's often too late. Yep. The product's already gone down a certain road, and it has a lot of momentum.
Yep, I absolutely agree. It has to be done at the development layer. There's no other way, and that's, I think, one of the most important decisions that we made very early on.
Actually, in terms of interdisciplinary collaboration, the terminology is another the critical issues. For example, actually, the machine learning researchers, when machine learning researchers refer to natural language understanding, it's kind of the intent classification or something like prediction style problem. But philosophers and the psychologists should why that is understanding. So these are the different meaning for the same terms makes some more confusion to the collaboration, I think. So in many cases, before the entering more the deep discussion, some terminology consensus is a very important issue for the discussing with the other background players, I think.
I agree with you entirely. That has been one of the main challenges for me when working in an interdisciplinary space, is just getting everybody to agree on a consensus of what different terms mean or what we mean when we talk about different things. And you know, when you mentioned social media earlier, James, I think that's such a fantastic example of a technology that was used in a way that nobody really anticipated. So, you know, I consider social media to be something new in my lifetime, you know. So I grew up for a period where there wasn't social media, and social media became a thing, you know, at a point in my life. And it's really interesting for me to remember what social media was when it started versus its own basically universe that it's become today. You know, if you had told somebody 15 years ago that you could have a job, that your job was social media, you were a content creator or something like that, I don't know that we all could have anticipated this. So it's a really fantastic example of technology kind of shaping and forming in the way that users shape and form that technology. So I do have a question for you about that.
This is one of the clear reasons why we are at least a little more ahead on thinking about regulation and how to do responsible AI, because everyone knows we've been burned. I mean, I met an engineer who was one of the first engineers at Facebook last week in Tahoe, and he's now at OpenAI, and he said, yeah, we were making it, we thought it was just a, you know, share with your friends, right? That's what it was intended for, but it clearly got, you know, changed in terms of once it became a business and what it really got used for. And same thing could be happening with AI. You know, we might think, yeah, I was just making a chatbot for you to do these simple tasks, but it may be, I wouldn't even say may, it will be used for many things that they didn't anticipate. And so getting ahead of thinking about what are potential harms and how we might avoid them is something that we need to spend the time doing.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that's really important is that as soon as a potential harm is identified, sharing that information, because if we're not sharing it and we're waiting until it's too late, I think social media is again another example where you knew eventually of the harms, but I think there are people that knew long before it became public and you could see it in society. So it's incumbent upon technology providers to be very clear as soon as they see a harm, admit that that harm has happened, and take corrective action as soon as possible.
You know, what's also interesting about social media is that it's also a really fantastic example of the impacts of digital divides. When you think about the kind of accessibility that social media provides for you and not having access to that accessibility. So my question for you, Jung-Woo, is can you explain a little bit more specifically what the impacts are of digital divides across different countries?
I'm sorry, I dropped my first mark.
That's okay, no worries.
Please.
Can you explain more specifically what the impacts are of digital divides across different countries?
Yes, I think this digital divide makes them much more the divide or the gaps in their the growth or the other opportunity to in many industries or the society, I think. So, actually, nowadays, considering the AI technology, the advancement of AI technology, so this digital divide became to the AI divide issues because considering the AI require many data, trained data, and the other systems but this digital infrastructure or digital environment makes them the more or all of the components for the AI, right? So for the developing countries or the global sized countries, actually the developed countries or the AI tech giant should provide a tool or some the framework for the developing countries or global south countries, some opportunity to, so for example, we can make some of the tools for the data, the training data, or they make some their own models or for evaluation, for the safety evaluation or responsibility evaluation protocols for each country, I think. But because this making a platform for the AI models or digital infrastructures requires many experiences on the expertises. So we can provide a tool or the platform for accessible for each the developed countries. So I think the much more these accessibility should make the more sustainable, more the sustainability, I think, yeah.
And so, Amy, from your perspective, how much does accessibility come into the equation when you're looking at the development of these systems?
And when you say accessibility, are you talking about for general population, or are you talking about broad accessibility for even those who have different use cases? Just want to
broad accessibility, because you know we're talking about global digital divides, but there are also digital divides across different nations. Like I'm sure in the US there is probably a huge digital divide across different demographics as well.
Yeah, I think broad accessibility is going to be incredibly important, and I think you touched on this a little bit. Is starting very understanding that AI can and should be used in classrooms, and embracing it very early is one way to have more broad accessibility. So widespread use in public schools in an appropriate manner is one way where I think you can bridge a digital divide. We've seen it countless times with accessible internet is a very good example inside the United States. There are broad areas where you do not necessarily still have widely available accessible internet, but you do at school. And that's where you have children who are able to use the internet, experience that, learn and grow from that. I think you need to look at AI exactly the same way and start at a young age in that way, and not just in the United States, but in the global south and other areas as well.
So then, moving on to you, James, from an educational perspective, how much does accessibility come into the way that you design education around these systems?
Well, I think education accessibility is in two different things. So one is about just access to the technology and the internet that you need. But another one is that this technology has this great power to be personalized to people who have different abilities. So we're talking about traditional accessibility in terms of disability, but also different abilities in terms of people's educational abilities, in terms of the way they learn, in terms of just what their interests are and what gets them excited. You know, our current educational system was really created for a kind of as a factory for you know, the workers of the 20th century. And so in some ways we're going to need to change our educational system, and this technology is going to be one of the keys to helping personalize it, make it more interesting, make it more exciting. And that, to me, will help with accessibility. But again, it will not happen by itself. It will only happen if different countries and societies decide, I really want that, because it's going to take investment to make those applications. Not just some companies not just going to come up with it and do the right thing. We as a society are going to have to put in the resources to cause that to happen and cause that change to happen.
And I think we'll have to dispel some fear, right? Because in the education system in particular, there's the idea of, oh, it'll just write your essay and that will be the end of it. And that's not.
Well, that's why the next 5 years, as I say, it's going to be a big fight, because there will be the ones who are like, no, keep it out, which is impossible. It will come in. But then it's going to take time for educators, and there's lots of them out there today who are figuring it out. How do we change the way we teach with this tool? How do we change the way we evaluate with this tool? That is a massive change. And often it's going to mean not evaluating in the way that was the easiest for teachers to grade. We're going to have to evaluate in new ways, sometimes harder, sometimes just different. But that is going to take time for those best practices to be figured out and then to spread. So in 10 years, though, we will look back and we'll say, this is a lot better than the way we taught 20 years ago.
Yeah, it could be such an exciting classroom, right? The conversation and the ability to learn that way. I agree.
So we're coming to the end of our session now, and I would like to circle this back to policymakers. So I'm going to ask each of you to very briefly, because I'm conscious of time, if there is one takeaway you would want policymakers to take away from this discussion. So Jung-woo, I'll start with you.
Yes, considering the safety or the risk issue of the frontier AIs, but we need to prepare the safety guideline or the approaches. But we need to respect the opportunity and the innovation and the benefit of generative AI. So I think the balance between the innovation and the regulation is very important. Also, regulation should be a tool for enhance the innovation and opportunity.
Perfect. Amy, your one takeaway?
Please try the technology.
That's a wonderful one. And James, we'll end with you. Your takeaway.
Well, I'm going to agree with this idea of balance. We don't want to stifle innovation, but also focus on, again, those 3 Ds or the 4 Ds, the things that are really happening, the real harms, and not science fiction.
That's wonderful. I want to thank you all for your time today. If you can join me in thanking our panel, please.
Thank you very much. Let's give a big round of applause to our moderator and esteemed speakers. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us until the very end of our day 1 journey. And following this, the welcome reception will begin at the Grand Ballroom at the Westin Chosun Hotel, which is a 5-minute walk away from this hotel, Lotte Hotel. Welcome reception will be hosted by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea for all participants. And the welcome reception will commence with the remarks delivered by our Minister, His Excellency Cho Tae-yeol, featuring cultural performances and a standing buffet as well. And it will also offer a delightful blend of entertainment and cuisine. So ladies and gentlemen, please join us at the welcome reception. And ladies and gentlemen, we will start our day 2 tomorrow morning. We ask for your keen interest and active participation until the very end. Thank you very much for your participation. See you tomorrow. Thank you.